Get ready for a chilling night. For the next 2 hours, let yourself be immersed in horror stories that will accompany you until you sleep. If these dark narratives help you delve into the world of dreams, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more eerily peaceful nights. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink as I set up my tent in the secluded clearing. It was my 13th solo camping trip, and I felt more confident than ever. The fresh forest air filled my lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. I smiled, feeling the familiar sense of freedom that only the wild could provide. As I arranged my belongings, my mind wandered to the scary camping stories we used to tell around the campfire when I was a child. I chuckled quietly, thinking of how distant those tales seemed now. I was an experienced camper after all. Nothing could scare me here. Night fell quickly, and I lit a small campfire. The flames danced, casting restless shadows on the trees around me. I picked up my favorite book and snuggled close to the fire, letting myself get absorbed in the story. Occasionally a branch would snap in the darkness, but I barely noticed, engrossed in my reading. Hours passed, and I finally decided it was time to sleep. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, eager for the day of hiking that awaited me. I lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake a strange unease. It was as if something was out of place, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I shook my head, brushing off these thoughts. It's just the remnants of those old horror stories, I told myself. Little did I know that I was about to live through my own scary camping experience, one that would surpass any ghost story I had ever heard. Weeks after my return, I sat in my office, eager to relive the memories of my latest nature adventure. I spread the newly developed photos across the table, a nostalgic smile playing on my lips. The first images were exactly what I expected. Breathtaking landscapes, fascinating wildlife, and moments of pure serenity. My heart skipped a beat when I reached the 5th roll. There, among the usual photos, was an image that froze the blood in my veins. It was me, sleeping in my tent, the flash of the camera illuminating my serene face. My hands trembled as I flipped to the next photo. Again, there I was, asleep on a different night. A chill ran down my spine as I frantically flipped through the remaining photos. Every 3rd or 4th image, there I was, completely vulnerable in my sleep. The dates on the corners of the photos confirmed my worst nightmare. Someone had been watching me throughout my entire trip, invading my most intimate space night after night. Memories of the trip flooded my mind. The man fishing at the truck stop. Could it have been him? Or someone I hadn't even noticed? The scary stories I had dismissed as mere haunted camping tales now seemed terrifyingly real. My refuge in nature had turned into a summer camp horror story setting. Tears of fear and anger streamed down my face as I faced the evidence of my naivety. How could I have been so careless? How did I not notice the presence of an intruder for 2 whole weeks? The forest I so loved now seemed like a dark, threatening place, filled with unseen dangers and malicious gazes. The weeks following my terrifying discovery were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every shadow in my home seemed to hide a threat. Every nocturnal noise made me jump. My husband, concerned, tried to comfort me, but his reassuring words felt empty against the horror I had experienced. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to face my fears. I sat in the living room, the photos spread out before me in the dim light of a lamp. I forced myself to examine each image, searching for clues, any detail that could help me understand what had happened. That was when I noticed something I had missed in my initial review. In one of the photos, partially hidden by the shadows of the tent, there was a silhouette. It was just an outline, but unmistakably human. My heart raced. That shadowy figure was tangible proof that my terrifying camping experiences were not a product of my imagination. Someone had indeed been there, watching me, invading my space. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and called the police. The words tumbled out in a torrent as I reported my scary camping story, the true ghost stories of summer I had lived. The officer on the other end of the line listened patiently, but I could sense the incredulity in his voice as he promised to investigate. As I hung up the phone, a realization hit me with full force. My love for nature, my passion for camping, all of it had been stained by this experience. The forests that once brought me peace now seemed haunted by unseen presences. The nocturnal sounds that used to calm me now. I realized that perhaps I would never be able to enjoy a night under the stars without being haunted by the memories of that terrible summer. Months passed, and the police investigation led nowhere. The authorities classified the incident as an isolated case, likely the work of some intrusive hiker. But to me, the wound remained open, an invisible scar that I carried with me every day. One afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Sarah, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. She invited me to a camper reunion, a gathering around the campfire to share stories and memories. My first instinct was to refuse, but something within me hesitated. Perhaps, I thought, facing my fears could be the first step to overcoming them. On the night of the gathering, I sat rigidly around the fire, surrounded by smiling faces and lively voices. The smell of the smoke and the warmth of the flames brought back memories I had tried to bury. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. Then, with a deep sigh, I began to tell my story. As the words flowed, I saw the smiles turn into expressions of shock and sympathy. I shared the details of the photos, the feeling of violation, the fear that now accompanied me. To my surprise, instead of judgment, I found understanding. Others began to share their own scary camping experiences, stories of strange encounters and inexplicable moments in the forests. As I listened to these narratives, something shifted within me. I realized that I wasn't alone in my fears, that others also carried similar scars. The scary campfire stories we were sharing weren't just tales to entertain, but a way to process our experiences, to find strength in our shared vulnerability. On that night, as the flames died down and the stars shone above, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The fear was still there, a shadowy presence in the corners of my mind, but now I had something more. The understanding that even the most terrifying experiences can teach us about resilience and the importance of community. As I walked home under the starry sky, I promised myself that one day, maybe not today, nor tomorrow, but someday, I would return to the forests, not to forget, but to rediscover the beauty I had once known, armed with the strength I had found in my own story of overcoming. I never imagined that an innocent night expedition would turn into one of the most terrifying deep forest stories ever experienced. I'm Thorn, and along with my friends Lysander and Eloan, we decided to explore a shadowy trail in the Shadowmere forest. We were young, fearless, and eager for thrills. Little did we know that we were about to live through one of the most chilling forest horror stories of our lives. Darkness quickly engulfed the landscape as we ventured into the thick vegetation. The air was dense, heavy with moisture that seemed to cling to our skin. Our footsteps echoed peculiarly, as if the forest itself was monitoring our every move, absorbing our presence. Lysander, always the boldest, led the way with his flashlight, while Eloan and I followed closely behind. "Do you guys hear that?" Eloan murmured, her voice wavering. We froze, straining our ears. A low, guttural sound reverberated in the distance, sending my heart racing. "It's probably just some animal," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. But there was something about that noise that sounded abnormal, unnatural. It was as if the forest was sending us a sinister warning. We continued our journey, but the surroundings seemed to shift subtly. The trees appeared to bend towards us, their twisted branches casting grotesque shadows on the forest floor. The wind whispered through the foliage, carrying with it the echo of distant laughter and muffled screams. I tried to convince myself that it was just our imagination playing tricks. Yet, with each step, we ventured deeper into the bowels of that eerie forest, and the feeling of not being alone grew with every passing moment. Then we caught a glimpse of it, a flash of movement in the twilight, too quick to be captured by our flashlights. Something bulky, impossible to identify, but undeniably present. Eloan grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What was that?" she asked, her voice laced with terror. Lysander, for the first time, hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we should head back." In that moment, we understood that we were about to experience one of those scary encounters from the legends of deep forests. But this time, it was real, and we were at its center. Fear seeped into our bones as we decided to turn back. Lysander, his usual bravado completely gone, suggested, "Let's go back the same way, fast and quiet." We nodded tensely, our eyes frantically scanning the surrounding darkness. The forest, once a playground for adventures, had transformed into a horror story setting, each shadow potentially hiding indescribable threats. As we moved, the sounds of the forest intensified. Branches snapped under our feet, echoing like gunshots in the night. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it unintelligible whispers. Elowen grabbed my hand, her icy fingers trembling against mine. "Born," she whispered, "do you hear that? It sounds like something is following us." I stopped, straining my ears. At first, I only heard the frantic beating of my heart. Then, I perceived it. A rhythmic sound, like heavy footsteps coming from behind us. It alternated between fast and slow, as if the creature was playing with us. It was one of those terrifying encounters that I would never forget. A scary story unfolding in real time. Lysander, his usual bravado completely gone, murmured, "Run, now." He didn't need to say it twice. We sprinted down the trail, branches lashing at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every hurried step. Terror propelled us forward, turning the forest into a blur of shadows and distorted shapes. The sounds of pursuit intensified, drawing closer with each passing second. My heart threatened to burst from my chest, my lungs burning with the effort. Then, Elowen stumbled, falling heavily to the forest floor. I stopped to help her, and that was when I saw it. A massive figure, darker than the night around it, loomed between the trees. It had no distinct shape. Its contours seemed to shift and undulate like smoke. But the eyes, the eyes shone with a malevolent intelligence that chilled my soul. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a stare with that creature. It was as if we were living one of those true horror stories we heard around the campfire, but infinitely more terrifying. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving only the echo of a guttural growl. The sound of that growl still reverberated in our ears as we resumed our desperate escape. The forest, now completely hostile, seemed to conspire against us. Sharp branches tore at our clothes and skin. Treacherous roots threatened to trip us with every hurried step. We were living one of the most spine-chilling forest stories, and the fear of not surviving to tell the tale was palpable. "Over here!" Lysander shouted, pointing to a clearing ahead. We ran towards the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, hoping to find salvation. But as we reached it, we realized our terrible mistake. The clearing was actually the edge of a steep cliff, completely blocking our escape. Breathless and panicked, we turned back to face the darkness of the forest. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our rapid breathing and the occasional snap of distant branches. "What do we do now?" Elowen whispered, her voice thick with fear. Before any of us could respond, a terrifying howl pierced the air, making our blood run cold. It was a sound that did not belong in this world, a mix of fury and hunger that defied comprehension. "It's coming!" I shouted, my voice unrecognizable with terror. In that moment of sheer horror, we made an unthinkable decision. With the creature rapidly approaching and the cliff at our backs, we chose what seemed to be the lesser of two evils. Holding on to each other, we jumped off the cliff's edge into the dark waters of a river below. The fall seemed to last an eternity. The wind howled in our ears, mixing with our screams of terror. For a brief instant, I saw the silhouette of the creature on the cliff's edge, its bright eyes following us as we fell. The impact with the water was brutal. The icy current enveloped us, threatening to drag us into the depths. We struggled against the current, grasping at anything we could reach. Miraculously, we managed to drag ourselves to the shore. Crawling out of the water, shivering with cold and fear, exhausted and in shock, we huddled together in silence, unable to believe what we had just experienced. We had survived one of the most unbelievable hauntings one could imagine, a story that bordered on the paranormal, but was painfully real to us. As the first ray of sunlight pierced the morning mist, we found ourselves still trembling by the river's edge, our clothes soaked and clinging to our bodies. The silence among us was heavy, burdened by the weight of the previous night's events. We had survived one of the most disturbing forest horror stories, but the emotional toll was evident in our haunted gazes. Lysander was the first to break the silence. "We need to get out of here," he murmured, his voice hoarse and devoid of his usual confidence. We nodded without speaking, slowly getting to our feet. Our bodies ached, marked by scratches and bruises from our desperate escape through the forest and the fall into the river. We walked slowly along the riverbank, navigating by the rising sun. The forest, which now seemed eerily peaceful in the daylight, held the secrets of the previous night. Every sound, the chirp of a bird, the rustle of leaves made us flinch, momentarily reliving the terror we had experienced. What was that thing? Eloan finally voiced the question haunting our minds. No one immediately answered. How could we explain the unexplainable? That creature, with its bright eyes and indistinct form, defied any rational explanation. It was an enigma straight out of the legends of deep forests, a nightmare brought to life. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally reached the outskirts of the town. The sight of the first houses brought an indescribable relief, but also a sense of unreality. How could we return to our normal lives after facing the unimaginable? We stopped at the forest's edge, looking back one last time. The density of the trees seemed to hide countless secrets, spine-chilling stories yet untold. We made a silent pact in that moment. We'd never return to that place, and we would never speak of what happened. As we walked away, carrying with us one of the true scary stories that few would believe, I realized that something fundamental had changed within us. The innocence of youth had been replaced by a dark knowledge of the mysteries lurking in the shadows of the world. Our adventure in the Shadowmere forest had come to an end, but the memories of that terrifying night would linger forever. A silent reminder of the horrors that lurk in the depths of mysterious forests, waiting for the unwary who dare to disturb their domain. I will never forget that Christmas night in the deep forest. I, Lisa, at just 5 years old, was camping with my family and friends in a dense and mysterious woodland. The cold air nipped at our cheeks as 9 of us kids ran among the towering trees, our laughter echoing in the darkness. Our parents gave us a walkie-talkie, our lifeline in that vast greenery. "Don't wander too far," warned my mother, Rose, her eyes filled with concern as they shone in the firelight. I promised we would stay close. Little did I know that night would become one of the true scary stories that would haunt me for years. As we played hide and seek among the knotted trunks, the walkie-talkie crackled, making us pause. A deep, unfamiliar voice emerged from the device, sending shivers down my spine. "Ho, ho, ho! Children, it's Santa Claus here," the voice said, with a cheerfulness that seemed forced. "I'm trying to find you to deliver your presents. How about you help me look?" My heart raced, a mix of excitement and inexplicable fear settling in my chest. I looked to my friends Willow, River, and the others, their faces, a mix of delight and confusion. "Let's go!" shouted Willow, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. We ran back to the campsite, our small legs struggling against the roots and stones in the dark path. The forest seemed denser, the shadows more menacing. We arrived breathless, shouting about Santa Claus on the walkie-talkie. But our parents' reaction was not what we expected. Their faces paled, exchanging worried glances that we didn't understand at the time. My father, Everett's face hardened as he heard our story. Without a word, he snatched the walkie-talkie from our trembling hands. The silence that followed was scarier than any forest noise. The adults huddled, whispering urgently, casting furtive glances into the darkness that surrounded us. "Kids, stay close to the fire," ordered Uncle Jasper, his usually jovial voice now laden with tension. We obeyed, huddling close to the crackling flames, seeking comfort in their warmth as excitement gave way to growing fear. As the night progressed, the woodland seemed to come alive. Branches snapped in the darkness. Leaves rustled without any apparent wind. Every sound made my heart jump, imagining what might be lurking in the shadows. Was it really Santa Claus, or something more sinister? River, the oldest among us, tried to distract us with stories, but even his words fell flat against the terror that had settled in our campsite. The adults took turns keeping watch, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. In a moment of courage, or perhaps childish naivety, I approached my mother. "Mommy," I whispered, "why can't we go look for Santa Claus?" Her eyes, usually full of warmth, were cold with fear. She pulled me close, her voice trembling slightly as she replied, "Sometimes, dear, there are things in the deep forests that are best left alone." Her words, more than anything, solidified the terror of that night in my young mind. The hours dragged like shadows in the forest, each minute feeling like an eternity. The sound of breaking branches in the distance made us jump, imagining scary stories of creatures lurking in the darkness. The campfire, our only source of light and comfort, cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, transforming them into threatening figures. Willow, always the bravest among us, whispered, "What if it's not really Santa Claus?" Her question hung in the air, voicing the fear we all felt. River, trying to maintain calm, replied, "Maybe it's just someone playing a prank." But the tremor in his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. The adults kept a constant vigil, their eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness beyond the campfire's light. Uncle Jasper and my father, Everett, spoke in low tones, their words laden with concern. Could be anyone. Dangerous. Children at risk. Fragments of their conversation reached my ears, heightening my anxiety. As the night wore on, the sounds of the forest seemed to intensify. The distant howl of a wolf made my blood run cold. The trees creaked and moaned in the wind, as if they were alive and aware of our presence. Every unexpected noise made me imagine the owner of that mysterious voice sneaking up on our campsite. Exhausted by fear and the long night, we children finally succumbed to sleep, huddled together like frightened pups. But my sleep was agitated, filled with nightmares of shadowy figures moving among the trees, calling my name with inhuman voices. I woke up several times, my heart pounding wildly, only to see the adults still vigilant, their tense faces illuminated by the dying fire. The sunrise finally dispersed the forest shadows, bringing with it a tangible relief. In the daylight, the woodland seemed less threatening, but the fear of the previous night still lingered over us like a persistent fog. The adults, with dark circles under their eyes from a sleepless night, began to break down the campsite with an urgency that didn't go unnoticed. As we packed up, I overheard snippets of conversations among the adults. Words like danger, predator, and authorities floated in the air, fueling my already active imagination. My mother rose, noticing my anxious gaze, knelt beside me. "Lisa," she said softly, "what happened last night was very serious. That voice on the walkie-talkie, it wasn't Santa Claus." Her grave tone made my stomach sink. "But who was it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Someone who shouldn't be here, dear. Someone dangerous." The reality of the situation began to settle in, transforming what I thought was a Christmas adventure into one of the true horror stories I would never forget. As we prepared to leave, River, with an unusual seriousness for his age, gathered us kids together. "Remember," he said, "what happened here stays between us. It's our deep forest secret." I nodded, feeling the weight of that silent pact. That experience bonded us in a way that only shared fear could. Years passed, and that night in the forest became one of the scary stories we occasionally shared in whispers. But for me, Lisa, it remained more than that. It was a vivid reminder of the hidden dangers in the shadows, of the threats that lurk beyond our understanding. The deep forest kept its secret, but it left in me a permanent echo of respect for the unknown, and an acute awareness that not all voices in the darkness are friendly. The sun was setting as we arrived at the public park near Antigonish, Nova Scotia. My wife and I were exhausted after a long day of traveling. Eager to set up camp and rest, the spot seemed perfect. A cliff overlooking the ocean, secluded and peaceful. Only a couple of elderly folks and a fifth wheel occupied the space beyond us. "Look, dear, an old lighthouse," my wife exclaimed. pointing to the imposing structure near the parking lot. We decided to pitch our tent right there at the base of the lighthouse. The salty sea air filled our lungs as we unloaded the car. As we set up the tent, I noticed something odd about the lighthouse. "Are you seeing this?" I asked. The light was blinking in a peculiar pattern. 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off, repeatedly. "Must be normal," she replied, shrugging it off. I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that was starting to settle in my stomach. As night fell, the wind picked up, bringing with it a low, constant howl. The trees in the surrounding forest seemed to bend towards us, as if reaching out to grab us. I tried to shake off these dark thoughts, focusing on preparing our simple dinner. Sitting outside the tent, we watched the stars emerge in the dark sky. The rhythmic blinking of the lighthouse created dancing shadows around us. My wife snuggled closer to me, trembling slightly. "It's getting chilly," she murmured. But I knew it wasn't just the cold that bothered her. There was something in the air, a palpable tension that made my hairs stand on end. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. The lighthouse's intermittent blinking continued its relentless pattern, illuminating the tent walls at regular intervals. But it wasn't the light that had awakened me. A strange sound was coming from the forest that surrounded us, a low, drawn-out moan that made my heart race. "Are you hearing that?" I whispered to my wife, who had also woken up. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We sat in silence, straining to hear every noise. The moan was replaced by an unsettling buzzing, as if thousands of insects were approaching. Then we heard what sounded like distant crying. My mind raced, trying to find rational explanations for these disturbing sounds. Could they be wild animals? The wind howling through the trees? Or something more sinister? The scary camping stories we heard as children suddenly seemed terribly real. The lighthouse continued its relentless cycle, 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off. With each moment of darkness, I swore I could see shadows moving outside the tent. My wife clutched my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. I wanted to agree, wanted to jump in the car and drive away from this haunted place, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or the morbid curiosity that makes us want to uncover the source of our fears. "Let's wait until dawn," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It can't be much longer now." Little did I know that the night still held more terrifying surprises. The minutes dragged on like hours as we waited for sunrise. The lighthouse kept its hypnotic rhythm, and the strange sounds from the forest didn't cease. My wife and I huddled together, seeking comfort in each other's arms as we faced this scary summer night. Suddenly we heard footsteps approaching our tent. My heart leaped to my throat. Were these the owners of those mysterious voices, or perhaps the old sea captain my overactive imagination had conjured? With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent, prepared for the worst. To my surprise and relief, it was the elderly couple from the fifth wheel. "Are you hearing those noises too?" the gentleman asked, his voice trembling with concern. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief that we weren't the only ones experiencing this camping terror. Together, we decided to investigate the source of the sounds. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the forest. As we drew closer, the noises became clearer. To our surprise, they weren't ghostly moans or supernatural cries, but the sound of industrial equipment. At dawn, we discovered the truth behind our night of horror. A construction was underway at the bottom of the cliff, hidden from our view. The moans and buzzing were actually the sound of machines working through the night. The crying was the wind passing through exposed pipes. We laughed nervously, relieved to find out that our terrifying camping experience had a perfectly normal explanation. The lighthouse, we later learned, blinked in that peculiar way to warn ships about the ongoing construction. As we packed up our camp, we reflected on how our minds can twist the unknown into something terrifying. This trip taught us a valuable lesson about facing our fears and seeking the truth behind them. We got back into the car, exhausted but relieved, ready to continue our journey. Although we hadn't encountered actual ghosts or supernatural entities, this night would forever remain in our memory as one of the scariest camping stories we had ever experienced. As we drove away from the cliff, the morning sun finally dispelled the last shadows of the previous night. My wife and I remained silent for a while, each lost in our own thoughts about our haunted camping experience. You know, she finally broke the silence. Despite the scare, it was actually an interesting night. I laughed, still a bit nervous. Interesting is a gentle way of saying terrifying, I replied, but I had to agree with her. Our nocturnal adventure would certainly be a great story to tell our friends. As the miles passed, we started discussing other scary camping stories we had heard. We compared our experience with famous camping legends and forest horror tales. Although our story had a rational explanation in the end, we realized it was no less thrilling than those with supernatural elements. It's funny how fear can distort our perception, I commented. Those normal construction sounds turned into a symphony of terror in our minds. My wife nodded, adding, "And the lighthouse. Who would have thought a blinking light could scare us so much?" As the day progressed, and we neared our next destination, we stopped for lunch at a small roadside diner. There, we shared our story with the friendly waiter, who listened with interest. "You're not the first ones to be spooked by that cliff," he told us with a knowing smile. "We've got plenty of mysterious summer stories around here." We left the diner with a new perspective. Our involuntary night of terror had turned into a funny anecdote, a true scary camping story of summer to add to our collection of travel memories. "I guess we learned a valuable lesson," my wife said as we got back on the road. "Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we create in our own minds." I agreed, feeling a new appreciation for our ability to face the unknown together. As we continued our journey through Nova Scotia, we carried with us not only the memory of a scary night, but also a new sense of adventure and a deeper understanding of how our minds interpret the world around us. And who knows, maybe at our next stop, we would encounter more intriguing stories to add to our collection of mysterious camping tales. I never imagined that a simple trip to reconnect with nature would turn into one of those bone-chilling, true scary stories from the deep forest that I had often read about online. My name is Alec, and along with my friends Bryn, Axel, and Sage, we decided to escape the chaos of New York City for a weekend. Our destination: a secluded cabin nestled in the heart of a dense forest in the northern part of the state. The sun was already setting by the time we finally reached the cabin. After hours of driving along winding roads that grew narrower by the mile, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. A welcome change from the asphalt and pollution of the city. Axel, always the most enthusiastic of the group, jumped out of the car as soon as we stopped. "Finally, welcome to paradise, guys," he exclaimed, stretching his arms wide as if to embrace the entire forest. Bryn and Sage exchanged skeptical glances, but I could feel a mix of excitement and apprehension bubbling in my stomach. As we unloaded the car, I couldn't help but notice the oppressive silence that surrounded us. There were no car noises, no sirens, no constant hum of the city, just the occasional chirping of birds and the whisper of the wind in the trees. It felt as if the forest was watching us, waiting. We stepped into the cabin, a rustic wooden structure that seemed to have seen better days. The interior was simple: a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Sage, the architect among us, immediately started inspecting every corner, her professional eye at work. "This place is interesting," she murmured, running her finger along a dusty shelf. As night fell, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew heavier. Bryn suggested we make a bonfire outside to ease the tension. "Come on, guys. Some scary stories by the fire are exactly what we need to get into the forest mood," she said with a forced smile. Gathered around the crackling flames, we began sharing eerie tales we had heard over the years. Axel, always the most dramatic, wildly gesticulated as he narrated deep forest legends his grandfather used to tell. With each story, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, not just from the chilly night air but from a growing sense of unease. It was then that Sage, usually the most skeptical of us, suddenly turned pale and pointed towards the darkness beyond the firelight. Do you see that?" she stuttered. We followed her gaze, but saw nothing but the dancing shadows of the trees. Axel nervously laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Come on, Sage. Your imagination is getting the better of you." But I wasn't so sure. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadow sand, undefined form, darker than the night around it. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling that we were about to become characters in one of those spine-chilling stories we had just told. We decided to head back inside. The festive atmosphere completely dissipated. The cabin, which had initially felt cozy, now seemed claustrophobic. The wooden walls seemed to close in on us, as if the very cabin itself was suffocating us. Bryn suggested we play cards to distract ourselves, but none of us could focus. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind against the windows made us jump. As the night wore on, the tension inside the cabin became almost palpable. We decided to try to sleep, hoping that daylight would bring some relief to our frayed nerves. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep, the sounds of the forest seeming amplified in the stillness of the night. That was when I heard it. A low sound, almost inaudible at first, but gradually growing louder. It was like a hum, but not from insects. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I sat up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Axel? Bryn? Do you hear that?" I whispered into the dark, before anyone could respond. A sharp scream pierced the air. It was Sage. We rushed to her room, stumbling over each other in the darkness. When we finally managed to turn on a light, the scene that greeted us was one of pure horror straight out of deep forest-airy stories. Sage was huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror, frantically pointing towards the window. "It's out there!" she screamed. That thing." We crowded around the window, and that was when I saw it. A tall, lanky figure with limbs too long to be human hovered at the forest's edge. Its skin seemed to glow under the moonlight, a sickly pallor that contrasted with the darkness all around. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we froze, staring at this impossible creature. Then, as if sensing our gaze, the thing turned its head in our direction. It had no eyes, only dark cavities where they should have been. An inhuman smile spread across its face, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Panic took hold of us. Bryn screamed, Axel swore, and I simply froze. The creature began moving towards us, its movements erratic and unnatural. With each step it took, the air around it seemed to distort, as if its very presence was an affront to reality. "We have to get out of here," Axel shouted, finally breaking our collective trance. We ran out of the room, tripping over each other in our haste. I could hear a horrible sound coming from outside of something between a moan and a scream that made my blood run cold. It was as if the entire forest was screaming along with us. We reached the car, our hands shaking so badly we could barely open the doors. Axel turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and died. "No, no, no," he shouted, trying again. The sound of the creature drawing closer was deafening, echoing through the forest like a chorus of tortured souls. And then, in that moment when I thought all was lost, when I thought we would become just another one of those disturbing stories of disappearances in the forest, the engine finally caught. Axel floored the accelerator, and we sped off down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and that horrible thing behind. We drove through the night, in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When the sun finally rose, illuminating the road ahead, we collectively sighed with relief. We were alive, we had escaped, but we knew we would never be the same. To this day, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat. The image of that creature burned into my mind. We never returned to that forest, nor did we speak of what happened that night, but I know we all carry the scars of that experience. It was one of those true scary stories that changed our lives forever. an encounter with the unknown that showed us there are more mysteries in this world than we can comprehend. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers of the forest, reminding me that there are places where the veil between our world and the unknown is too thin for comfort. And somewhere out there in that deep, dark forest, I know that creature still waits, ready to create more terrifying forest tales for those unfortunate enough to cross its path. The fresh forest air filled my lungs as I settled into my hammock, ready for the third and final night of my solo camping trip in northeastern Ohio. The scary camping stories I heard as a child seemed so distant at that moment, enveloped by the tranquility of nature. Little did I know that I was about to live through one of the true horror stories that would haunt my thoughts for years. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up with an urgent need to urinate. I quietly stepped out of the hammock, walking a few paces away from my small campsite. That's when I noticed something that made my heart race. A headlamp about 30 meters away. I froze, my mind immediately filling with images from haunted camping tales. I observed for several minutes, trying to convince myself that it was just another camper, but something didn't feel right. The headlamp moved in a strange way, rising and falling as if someone was searching for something. Curiosity and fear battled within me, but I knew I had to investigate. With trembling hands, I put on my boots and grabbed my axe. Each step I took towards that mysterious light felt like approaching a camping nightmare. The damp ground muffled my footsteps as I stealthily made my way through the forest, my heart hammering so loudly I feared it could be heard. I was about 45 meters from my campsite when I spotted another headlamp. This one was closer, maybe just 12 meters away, moving between the trees. Terrified, I threw myself to the ground, covering myself with fallen leaves. The camping terror I had always thought was fiction was turning into a scary camping story right before my eyes. The man with the second headlamp passed within 3 meters of where I was lying, completely still. My heart felt like it wanted to leap out of my chest, and I struggled to control my breathing. The scary summer stories we used to tell around the campfire now seemed like a macabre prelude to this real-life camping horror. I watched in silence as the stranger stopped, lit a cigarette, and finished a beer. The sound of the can being thrown on the ground echoed in the quiet night, making me shudder. As soon as he moved away, I cautiously rose to my feet, determined to find out what was going on. I approached the first man I had seen, guided by the faint light of his cell phone. The sound of message notifications breaking the forest silence created a surreal atmosphere. I was close enough to see his face illuminated by the screen, when suddenly he stood up and started walking towards my hammock. Panic took over me, turning this terrifying camping experience into something even more sinister. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing with terrible possibilities. Then, driven by survival instinct, I began to move silently back to my campsite. That's when I heard the sound of destruction, my tarp being ripped, flashlights flickering, and male voices discussing him being here. These true scary camping stories I was living seemed straight out of a summer horror movie. Lying on the cold forest floor, I watched helplessly as my flashlight moved away, becoming just a dot of light in the darkness. The reality of this situation, scarier than any ghost story around the campfire, began to sink in. I was alone, unarmed, and at the mercy of hostile strangers in a dark forest. The hours until dawn seemed endless, each forest sound amplifying my fear and anxiety. When the first rays of sunlight finally pierced the tree canopy, I rose from my makeshift hiding spot, my muscles sore from tension and immobility. The fear that had accompanied me throughout the night still pulsed in my veins, turning what should have been a peaceful summer morning into a setting worthy of the scariest camping stories. I walked hesitantly back to my campsite, my heart heavy with anticipation of what I would find. The scene that greeted me was one of pure devastation, surpassing any scary camping experience I could have imagined. My hammock and tarp were in tatters, as if they had been attacked by a wild animal, or in this case, by men with hatchets. The ground was covered with the remains of what had once been my forest refuge. My survival kit lay trampled, its contents scattered like macabre confetti. The absence of my backpack, raincoat, and flashlight confirmed my suspicions. The intruders were not only vandalizing but also stealing. This wasn't just one of the many scary campfire stories, it was a real and tangible violation of my safety and property. Determined to better understand what had happened, I followed the trail left by the intruders. At the spot where I'd seen the first man, I found disturbing evidence of his presence. Pouches of chewing tobacco, 8 empty beer cans, and a discarded lighter. Each item told a story of disregard and potential violence that made my stomach churn. Continuing my improvised investigation, I reached the point where the second man had stopped. The scene was even more disturbing. An empty bag that likely contained drugs, cigarette butts scattered everywhere, and most repulsive of all, a pile of human feces with no sign of toilet paper. The raw and dirty reality of this terrifying camping experience hit me with full force, leaving me nauseated and deeply shaken. Standing amidst the wreckage of what should have been a peaceful nature adventure, I felt a mix of emotions overwhelming me. Anger, fear, confusion, and a deep sense of violation swirled within me, creating an internal whirlwind that threatened to knock me down. This experience surpassed any of the scary camping stories I had ever heard. It was real, visceral, and it had changed something fundamental inside me. With trembling hands, I began to gather what remained of my belongings. Each destroyed item was a reminder of the vulnerability I had experienced during the night. Memories of the terror-filled moments, lying still while strangers invaded my space, flashed in my mind like scenes from a summer camping horror movie. As I packed up, I couldn't help but think about how this experience compared to the true horror stories people share. I had always thought those stories were exaggerated, perhaps even made up to scare others. Now, I was the protagonist of one of those stories, and the reality was far more terrifying than any fiction. The sun was already high in the sky when I finally finished packing what was left. I looked one last time at the place that had been my temporary home for 2 nights. Now it looked like a scene straight out of haunted camping tales. The marks of the invasion were everywhere, reminding me that the true threats don't always come from the supernatural or the unknown, but often from other human beings. As I walked away from the campsite, carrying the weight of the remnants of my adventure and the memories that would haunt me for a long time, I made a promise to myself. I would never underestimate the power of scary forest stories or the importance of caution. Even in the seemingly most tranquil places, this haunted summer night had taught me a valuable lesson about the reality of danger and the fragility of the safety we often take for granted. As I walked back to civilization, I knew I carried with me not only the physical remains of my adventure, but also a new understanding of the world and myself, an understanding born of fear, survival, and the determination to never be caught unprepared. Again, the moon hung high in the sky as I, Luna, and my sister-in-law, Raven, ventured into the depths of the North Umpqua Trail in Oregon. The summer night enveloped the forest in a gentle warmth, and the air was scented with the fresh fragrance of pine trees. We packed supplies, including flashlights and a map, anticipating an exciting adventure. Have you ever come across the scary stories associated with this forest, Luna? Raven asked, her tone laden with intrigue as her eyes scanned the surrounding landscape. They say spirits roam these trails, leaving a trail of chills and mysteries. I laughed, the idea of forest horror stories seeming a bit far-fetched. Oh, Raven, you and your urban legends. I wouldn't buy into those forest horror tales for a million years. They're just made-up stories to entertain campers on nights like this. Raven smiled, her eyes sparkling with a mischievous glint in the faint moonlight. Maybe you're right, Luna. But there's something irresistibly fascinating about those paranormal forest encounters, don't you think? The idea that nature holds secrets that defy our understanding is intriguing. Our footsteps echoed along the trails, blending with the nocturnal sounds of the forest. The darkness deepened, enveloping us in its mysterious embrace as we ventured further away from the safety of our campsite. Suddenly, Raven stopped abruptly, causing me to almost bump into her. "Wait," she whispered, her voice urgent. I saw something. Over there, in the shadows. She pointed to a spot in the darkness where the trees seemed to dance with the breeze. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm night. "Let's keep walking," I insisted, my heart quickening. "It's probably just an animal or an illusion caused by the darkness. No need to dawdle." We quickened our pace, leaving behind the dancing shadows and the discomfort they evoked. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and as we walked, the moon cast ethereal lights through the treetops, creating intricate patterns on the forest floor. "Have you ever thought about how the forest feels different at night, Luna?" Raven commented, her voice echoing softly in the stillness. "It's as if we're in a whole new world, unknown and full of possibilities." I nodded, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Yes, it's as if the forest takes on a new personality when the sun sets. The sounds are different. The shadows seem longer and more menacing, and even the air feels laden with mystery." As we walked, a strange sound, one that didn't belong in the surroundings, began to infiltrate the night. It was like a distant whisper, laden with sadness and anguish. It seemed to come from all around, echoing through the trees like a gentle wind. Raven stopped once again, her expression concerned. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded my head, my heart pounding in my chest. Yes, it sounds sad, like a lament. We cautiously moved towards the sound, guided by a morbid curiosity. The trail opened up into a small clearing, and it was there that we discovered the source of the sorrowful sound. In the middle of the clearing sat a hooded figure on a large rock. They were turned away from us, their shoulders shaking as they let out soft moans. As we approached, the figure straightened, slowly turning to reveal a pale face and red, tear-filled eyes. My heart hammered in my chest at the sight of the hooded figure sitting on the rock, their eyes fixed on us. I exchanged a glance with Raven, seeing the mirror of my own fear in her eyes. Without a word, we silently turned and began to retreat, our hands finding and squeezing each other tightly. "Let's go," I whispered, pulling her gently back. Our steps turned into a desperate run as we fled the clearing. The figure remained still, a dark statue under the moonlight, but I felt its eyes on the back of my neck, piercing my spine. The trail seemed endless, the trees blurring past us as we ran as fast as we could. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the forest, blending with the sound of our pounding hearts. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind us, followed by the sound of quick footsteps. I looked over my shoulder and saw with horror that the hooded figure was chasing us, its eyes shining with determination in the darkness. "She's coming after us," I cried out, pulling Raven into an abrupt detour off the trail. We ran through the trees, dodging low branches and stepping on dry leaves, our feet making little noise compared to the determined steps behind us. The moon provided little light, making it difficult to navigate the rugged terrain, but fear propelled us forward. Raven stumbled and I caught her, my heart in my throat. We couldn't stop, not now. The figure was too close, its hood floating like a cape behind her. I spotted a creek and pulled Raven into the shadows. The water was icy, but it provided cover. We crouched, breathless, watching the figure run past, its bones tinkling sinisterly as it moved away. After our terrifying escape, Raven and I returned home, our hearts still racing from the chase. We barely slept that night, haunted by images of the hooded figure and its unsettling bones. The next morning, we made the decision to report the incident to the authorities. We described our experience to the local sheriff, who assured us he would investigate the area and try to find some clues about the hooded figure's identity. The days dragged on without a word from the sheriff. Anxiety grew within me, a mix of curiosity and fear about what we might have encountered in that forest. Finally, a few days later, the sheriff showed up at my door. His face was somber, and he seemed reluctant to share his findings. "What did you find?" I asked, my heart pounding. Was there any truth to the tale of the hooded figure? The sheriff hesitated, his eyes wandering the floor. "Look, Luna, I won't lie to you. There was something unusual about that area of the forest." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "We found evidence of disturbing activities, but I can't go into details." "Who was that woman?" I pressed, determined to get answers. Why was she chasing us? The sheriff lifted his eyes, his gaze serious. I can't reveal her identity, but I can tell you that you and Raven were in grave danger that night. The area has been the site of some strange incidents, and your presence there may have attracted the attention of something undesirable." My mouth went dry as his words sank in. "Are you saying we were in actual danger? Or what was after us?" The sheriff ran his hand over his face, a tired gesture. "Luna, all I can say is that sometimes there are things in the darkness that are best left unanswered. Some truths are too disturbing to be revealed." And with that, he left, leaving me with more questions than answers. In the years that followed, that night haunted my dreams. I never ventured onto the North Umpqua Trail again, and when I heard the area had been consumed by a wildfire, a chill ran down my spine. Perhaps the fire had purged the forest of its dark secrets, or perhaps it had unleashed something far more sinister. To some, the story may be just an urban legend, another one of the many forest horror stories, but to me, it's a constant reminder that there are things in the shadows that defy our comprehension, and that sometimes it's best to leave some mysteries unsolved. When I was a teenager, at the age of 16, my best friend Brandon and I had a ritual. Several times every summer, our families would go camping together at a state park, and every night, after the sun set and the forest was enveloped in shadows, the two of us would venture out to explore. We called it our ritual. It was an adventure, an escape from the monotony of everyday life. We boasted about our courage, laughing nervously as we ventured deeper into the darkness. We always brought flashlights, but often we'd dare each other to navigate with them off, relying only on the moon and stars for light. "Are you ready for tonight?" Brandon asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. We were sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and listening to our parents' ghost stories. I smiled, feeling a mix of thrill and nervousness. "Of course. Let's go." We sneaked past the tents, making sure everyone was asleep. The moon shone through the treetops, casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. We giggled, our whispers echoing in the night. "I think we're about 800 meters from the nearest campsite," Brandon commented as we walked along a familiar path. I nodded, my senses alert for any sound or movement. The forest felt different at night, more eerie and full of possibilities. We walked in silence, our steps soft on the leafy ground. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Our flashlights were on, but we kept them low, casting beams of light on the ground in front of us. "Have you ever heard about the legends of this forest?" Brandon asked suddenly, his voice low and hesitant. My heart skipped a beat. I loved horror stories, but I was also afraid of the unknown. "No," I murmured. "Why?" "Well, they say strange things happen here," he continued, his eyes gleaming with a mischievous glint. "Real-life horror stories about paranormal encounters in forests." I laughed nervously, trying to hide my growing unease. "Are you trying to scare me?" Brandon smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "I've heard some pretty scary forest stories. People going missing, shadows moving in the trees, whispers carried by the wind." Just then a sound made us stop, a soft whisper, like a gentle wind passing through the trees. We both fell silent, our hearts racing. "Did you hear that?" Brandon whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I nodded, my eyes scanning the darkness. Came again, a little closer. We both turned, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. And then we saw something that made our hearts freeze. There, on the ground, crawling towards us, was a figure. Our eyes widened in surprise and fear. The figure was whispering, the words unintelligible, just random sounds. We both stood frozen, our flashlights trembling in our hands. Who's there?" Brandon managed to ask, his voice shaking. The figure stopped and lifted its head. In the flashlight beam, we saw the face of a woman, her eyes vague and confused. Her hair was tangled, and her clothes were torn and dirty. She looked like she had stepped out of a horror story. I'm looking," she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "Looking for my campsite." We both stood mute for a moment, our eyes wide with surprise. Then I stepped forward, extending my hand. "Are you okay?" I asked. my voice strangely calm. "Did you get lost?" The woman seemed to focus on us for the first time, and her eyes widened in surprise. "My campsite," she repeated, her voice a little stronger. "I got lost." Without a word, we began to guide her back along the path. Our steps were quick, driven by a desire to escape the forest and our own fears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice sounding grateful. I think I got lost trying to find a bathroom. We helped her back to her campsite, where her friends greeted her with relief and surprise. They hadn't realized she was missing, and we wondered what could have happened if we hadn't found her. That night, which had started as an adventure, now felt like a distant dream. Sitting by the campfire, holding a cup of hot chocolate, I couldn't get the woman out of my head. Her sudden appearance in the forest, her unintelligible whispers, it all felt like part of a mysterious forest tale. "Do you think she was okay?" I asked Brandon, my eyes wandering into the darkness beyond the firelight. "I mean, she seemed a bit out of it," he sighed, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I don't know. Maybe she was just disoriented, lost in the forest." My thoughts wandered back to the horror stories of the forest I had heard over the years. Legends of haunted forests, supernatural encounters. Could there be any truth to them? "Do you think there's anything in this forest?" I asked, my voice low and hesitant. "Anything? Unexplainable?" Brandon smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "Who can say?" he replied, his voice carrying a tone of mystery. "The forest is an ancient place, full of secrets and stories. Who knows what might be lurking in the shadows?" My heart raced with the idea. "Do you think we saw her because we were out there, wandering in the night?" I asked, my voice carrying a tone of fear. What would have happened if we hadn't found her? Perhaps we'll never know. But one thing is certain, the forest keeps its secrets, and we as humans fear the unknown. That night, with its stories and mysterious encounters, left a lasting impression. I found myself pondering the secrets hidden in the depths of the forest, my mind weaving its own tales of the unknown. It was supposed to be an exciting adventure. I'm Taylor, an off-road enthusiast, decided to embark on a solo camping trip into the forest. My SUV was equipped with everything I needed: food, water, a good sound system, and even a comfortable fold-out bed. My plan was simple: drive to a secluded spot in the forest, set up camp, and spend a few days enjoying nature. I was confident and thrilled at the prospect of exploring the unknown. The night I arrived was peaceful and serene. The moon shone through the treetops, creating a magical atmosphere. I lit a campfire, opened a bottle of wine, and snuggled up in my seat, watching the dancing flames. I felt incredibly relaxed, away from the hustle of the city. This is life, I thought, smiling to myself. However, as the night progressed, a sense of unease began to settle in. I couldn't pinpoint the exact cause, but something felt out of place. The wind whispered through the pines, producing strange sounds, and shadows danced at the corners of my vision. My instincts told me I was not alone. Horror stories set in the forest began to invade my thoughts. I'd tried to convince myself that I was being foolish. These are just scary forest tales, I thought. There's nothing here but trees and wildlife. But still, I couldn't shake a sense of apprehension. I decided it was best to prepare for the night. I put away the empty wine bottle and extinguished the campfire, making sure all the embers were out. I locked the SUV's doors and double-checked that the windows were closed. When I lay down, I pulled a blanket up to my chin and tried to fall asleep. The wind softly howled, as if whispering a warning. Legends of haunted forests lingered in my mind, but I ignored them, forcing my eyes to grow heavy. I was determined to enjoy my night in the forest, no matter how persistent my worries were. I managed to fall asleep, despite the restlessness I felt. However, my sleep was interrupted by a distant and unsettling sound. It was as if someone were singing, but the melody was odd and dissonant. My eyes snapped open, and my heart began to pound. The darkness inside the SUV seemed deeper, and I felt momentarily disoriented. "Must be the wind," I murmured, trying to calm myself. "Or maybe some strange animal." Yet, the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't any animal I knew. The singing was almost human, but there was something wrong with it. It was as if the person were singing backward, or in some unknown language. A sense of fear coiled in my stomach. I was now fully awake, my body rigid with tension. My SUV suddenly felt small and vulnerable in the vastness of the forest. My eyes scanned the darkness beyond the windows, searching for any sign of movement. "This is ridiculous," I said aloud, trying to convince myself. "It's probably just some prankster hunter trying to scare people." But still, I couldn't shake the fear that was settling over me. Paranormal encounters in haunted forests haunted my imagination. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could discern the shapes of the trees and bushes surrounding me. The moon, hidden behind clouds, cast an eerie light on the landscape. Scary stories of forests echoed in my mind, and I wondered if there was any truth to them. My heart raced as I considered the possibility that I was not alone. "I just need to leave," I thought, feeling the sudden urge to escape the forest. But then, just as my heart was beginning to slow down, the singing stopped. The forest fell into a suffocating silence. I could feel the sweat trickling down my temple, and my throat was dry. I sat there, motionless, waiting, my heart pounding. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and even the wind had ceased. My SUV became a fortress, protecting me from the unknown. I felt like a trapped mouse waiting for a predator to appear. The minutes ticked by, and nothing happened. Slowly, I began to calm down, thinking that maybe my fear was unfounded. "You're letting your imagination run wild," I told myself. "There's nothing out there." Just then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was as if someone were dragging their feet across the ground, approaching my vehicle. My heart leaped into my throat, and I shrunk back, clutching the knife tightly. The sound stopped, and then I heard a sigh, followed by a soft tap on the window. My entire body froze. I couldn't move or breathe. The figure at the window was obscure, a dark shape against the night. "Hey!" My voice trembled. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. A wave of panic washed over me, and I found myself screaming something unintelligible. The figure retreated, and then I heard hurried footsteps fading away. I sat there, breathless, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to start the SUV and drive away as fast as I could. But then the reality of the situation hit me. I didn't know who or what that figure was, and blindly fleeing through the forest seemed like a terrible idea. My eyes turned to the window where the figure had appeared. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting light on the area. I could see marks on the ground where something had been dragged. A chill ran down my spine. The morning light bathed the forest, revealing a tranquil and serene landscape. The fog, like a soft veil, enveloped the trees, creating an almost magical atmosphere. I stepped out of my SUV, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension, as I thought about the strange encounter from the night before. The enigmatic marks on the ground, left by something being dragged, were still there, waiting to be deciphered. My heart fluttered as I recalled the mysterious figure who had knocked on my window. I was determined to find out who or what had been there. I ventured into the forest, my eyes alert for any clues. The fog, while adding an ethereal quality to the scene, also made it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. The marks on the ground seemed to be the only evidence that something unusual had occurred here. I followed the trail, my eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance in the forest. As I ventured deeper into the misty setting, my heart raced with the expectation of finding answers. However, the more I searched, the more the forest seemed to guard its secrets. The marks eventually disappeared, leading nowhere. I stopped, my heart sinking a little. I looked around, my eyes searching for anything out of the ordinary, but the forest appeared untouched, as if nothing unusual had taken place here. My encounter from the previous night seemed even more mysterious in the light of day. Who was that man? What was he doing in the forest? And why had he knocked on my window? My head was filled with unanswered questions. I decided it was time to leave. I returned to the SUV, my pace a little quicker than before. I started the engine and drove away, feeling a mix of frustration and relief. As I drove back to civilization, my thoughts wandered. Who was that mysterious man? What did he want, and why had he appeared at my window that night? The forest, with its legends and mysteries, had left me with more questions than answers. The sense of uncertainty persisted, and I found myself longing for answers that might never come. On a frigid winter night in North Dakota, a solitary walk home turned into a nightmare for a 19-year-old college student. After an evening of laughter and drinks with friends, he finds himself face to face with an enigmatic figure. I was walking through the snow, leaving the house where I had spent the last few hours. The moon illuminated the North Dakota landscape. Me, a 19-year-old college student, was spending my winter break with my cousins in this isolated place. The night had been filled with drinks and laughter in the basement of a friend's house. Now, at 3 a.m., I found myself alone in that vast whiteness, trying to make my way back to my relative's house. The alcohol was still in my system, making my steps unsteady and my mind fuzzy. As I walked, I recalled the scary stories my cousins had told earlier. Tales of people who had ventured into the deep forests of the region and never returned. Chilling accounts of mysterious encounters on cold winter nights. I tried not to think about it, but these thoughts kept creeping into my head. The path was familiar. Straight behind the house, through some wooded areas, and then across an open field. The moonlight reflected off the snow, creating shadows that danced with the wind in the trees. I looked down, focusing on each step to avoid slipping on the ice hidden beneath the snow. My body froze, not only from the biting cold but also from the shock of an unexpected encounter. The figure before me was tall and wore a ski mask that covered their entire face. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the howling wind in the surrounding trees. Trying to ease the tension, I let out a nervous laugh and gave a small wave, as if to say, "Hey, you startled me." But the stranger didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me through that impenetrable mask. The whole situation felt like something out of one of those true scary stories you hear around the campfire. Seconds dragged on like hours. My mind, still foggy from the alcohol, struggled to process what was happening. Who was this person? What were they doing alone in the eerie forest at this late hour? The horror stories my cousins had told earlier began to intertwine with the reality before me. The intense cold penetrated my clothes, but I barely felt it. All my attention was focused on that motionless figure. The moonlight cast strange shadows on the snow, giving the scene an even more sinister air. It was as if we were trapped in a surreal tableau, two strangers staring at each other in the midst of the white vastness. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't caused by the cold, but by a primal instinct of danger. A voice inside my head screamed, "You need to get out of here, now!" Without a second thought, I turned and started walking away as fast as I could towards my cousin's house. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears. As I hurried away, my mind slipped into panic. Each step in the deep snow felt like an eternity. Fear consumed me, fueled by the horror stories that now seemed terrifyingly real. The forest around me, once familiar, now felt like a nightmare setting. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps, expecting to see the stranger following me. The ski mask they wore was imprinted in my memory, an image I knew would haunt me for a long time. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of my labored breathing and the crunch of snow under my feet. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the forest to my right. The sound, likely caused by some nocturnal animal, was enough to send me into full-blown panic. Without thinking, I started running wildly. My feet sank into the snow, making each step difficult. The fear of the stranger possibly chasing me was overwhelming. As I ran, my mind spun with terrifying thoughts. What if they were following me? What if there were others like them in the forest? The stories of paranormal encounters and terrifying experiences that I had always considered mere urban legends now seemed frighteningly possible. The path to my cousin's house felt never-ending. Every shadow cast by the moonlight transformed into a threat in my fertile and terrified imagination. I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Adrenaline coursed through my body, propelling me through the snow, even as my muscles screamed with exhaustion. Finally, I spotted my cousin's house. Never had a sight brought me so much relief. I ran the last few meters as if my life depended on it, practically throwing myself at the front door. With trembling hands, I managed to unlock the door and rushed inside, quickly closing it behind me. Inside the house, the silence was deafening. My cousins had not yet returned. I leaned against the door, panting, trying to calm my breathing and my racing heart. The lights were off, and the shadows of the house seemed to move with every blink of my eyes. Slowly, the adrenaline began to wear off, and exhaustion took over my body. I dragged myself to the couch and collapsed on it. Unable to climb the stairs to the bedroom, my mind kept replaying the events of the night, trying to make sense of the surreal encounter in the eerie forest. As the hours passed, the sky began to brighten. The dawn light gradually seeped through the windows, dispelling the shadows of the night. With the arrival of day, my fears seemed less tangible, almost like a distant nightmare. Still, I couldn't shake off the sense of unease that the encounter had left. When my cousins finally returned, they found me still on the couch, with dark circles under my eyes and a distant look on my face. I tried to explain what had happened, but words seemed inadequate to describe the terror I had felt. They listened with a mix of concern and skepticism, likely attributing my story to a combination of alcohol, fatigue, and an overactive imagination. In the following days, I tried to rationalize what had occurred. Perhaps it was just another local out late at night. Maybe the alcohol and exhaustion had distorted my perception, turning a casual encounter into something more sinister. But a part of me knew that something about that night had been different, something I couldn't fully explain. That experience in the deep forests of North Dakota became one of the scary stories I would carry with me. A constant reminder that reality can sometimes be more terrifying than any horror tale. And although I try to convince myself that it was just a misunderstanding, a part of me will always wonder about the stranger with the ski mask and what could have happened if I hadn't fled that frigid night. What should have been a peaceful walk along a familiar trail turned into an indescribable nightmare. On a sunny day, my girlfriend and I ventured into the forest, seeking the peace and beauty of nature. But when we ventured off the marked trail, we encountered a disturbing figure atop a rocky formation, a sinister-looking man, bizarrely dressed, whose cold, empty eyes pierced our souls. I never thought that a simple walk could turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was a typical Saturday, and my girlfriend and I decided to explore a new trail in the forest near our town. The day was pleasant, with the sun filtering through the treetops, creating a play of light and shadow on the leaf-covered ground. We were young and adventurous, always seeking new thrills. I, at 25, worked as a freelance graphic designer, while my girlfriend, 2 years younger, was a biology student. Our shared passion for nature often led us to explore new places, but nothing could prepare us for what we would find in that deep forest. We started our journey enthusiastically, following the well-marked trail. The trees around us seemed to grow denser as we ventured further, their intertwined branches forming a canopy that blocked out more and more of the sunlight. The air became cooler and damper, carrying the scent of earth and decomposing vegetation. After about an hour of hiking, we noticed that the trail was starting to become less defined. The markers that had guided us were now scarce, and we had to rely more on our instincts. My girlfriend, always the more adventurous of the two of us, suggested we venture off the main trail to explore a bit. I hesitated for a moment, but her excitement was contagious, and I eventually agreed. That's when things started to change as we left the trail. The forest seemed to swallow the sound of our footsteps, creating an oppressive silence. The shadows seemed deeper, and a sense of unease began to settle in my chest. I tried to brush off these thoughts, convincing myself that it was just my overactive imagination. Little did I know that this innocent walk was about to turn into one of the most intense, scary stories I would ever experience. As we ventured deeper into the dense forest, the sense of disorientation grew. The trees seemed identical in every direction, and the terrain became increasingly steep. My girlfriend, ever the optimist, insisted that we were about to discover something amazing. I couldn't share her enthusiasm, Unease settled in my stomach. After an exhausting 2-hour hike, we spotted a clearing ahead. In the center of it stood a rocky formation, abruptly rising from the surrounding vegetation. My girlfriend exclaimed in surprise and joy, "Look." She pointed. "There's someone up there." Following her gaze, I noticed a solitary figure sitting atop the rock. As we drew closer, we could make out the silhouette more clearly. It appeared to be an old lady, sitting quietly with a sketchbook on her lap. The scene was so unexpected that we couldn't help but make some nervous jokes. "What if it's not an old lady?" I teased. "What if it's some psychopath waiting to attack us?" We laughed, trying to ease the tension that was inexplicably building up. The climb up the rocky formation was steep and challenging. Our muscles protested with each step, and sweat dripped down our foreheads. The anticipation of what we would find at the top mingled with a growing sense of apprehension. The jokes about serial killers and urban legends of haunted forests seemed less funny with each meter we ascended. Finally, we reached the top of the rocky formation. The view was breathtaking. Sheer cliffs dropped down to the distant ocean, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and red. But all of the beauty of the landscape was eclipsed by the shock that awaited us. The figure we had seen from a distance turned to face us, and my blood ran cold in my veins. It was not an old lady, but a man with a disturbing appearance, wearing a dress and with his hair braided into small ponytails, secured with elastic bands. The man stared at us with empty, cold eyes, his face marked by scars, and an expression that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just his unusual appearance that scared me, but the aura of danger that emanated from him. My mind raced, imagining 1,000 terrible scenarios, each worse than the last. Were these the true scary stories people told about encounters in deep forests? I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure. "Hello," I said with a voice that I barely recognized as my own. The stranger didn't respond, only staring at us with a penetrating gaze that seemed to pierce our souls. I felt my girlfriend squeeze my hand, her body tense beside me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. With my heart pounding in my chest, I decided it was time to leave. Without making any sudden movements, I started to back away slowly, pulling my girlfriend with me. The stranger didn't move, but his eyes followed us, like a predator watching its prey. Each step we took felt like an eternity, adrenaline coursing through our veins. As soon as we were far enough away, we turned and began to descend the rocky slope as quickly as we could. Fear gave us strength and agility we didn't know we possessed. Branches and stones cut our skin as we hurried down, but we barely felt the pain. Our only thought was to get as far away from that place and that disturbing man as possible. Darkness was falling quickly upon the forest, making our escape even more dangerous. We stumbled over roots and slid on loose stones, but we dared not stop. The survival terror propelled us forward, turning that night into one of the most terrifying experiences of our lives. The once peaceful forest had now become a shadowy, threatening labyrinth, a perfect setting for scary stories that we would never forget. The darkness of the forest enveloped us as we ran desperately, tripping over roots and branches. Fear propelled us forward, transforming the once serene forest into a backdrop for the most terrifying horror stories. Every shadow hid a potential threat, and every sound made us jump. Our ragged breathing and hurried footsteps were the soundtrack to this real-life nightmare. After what felt like an eternity, we finally spotted the distant lights of the town. The relief was momentary, as the fear of being pursued still consumed us. We constantly looked over our shoulders, fearing to see the disturbing figure emerge from the shadows. The scary stories we used to tell around campfires now seemed childish compared to the experience we had just lived through. When we finally reached the main road, we stopped to catch our breath. My girlfriend was pale, her eyes wide with terror. I held her tightly, feeling her body tremble against mine. "It's okay now," I murmured. more to reassure myself than her, but we both knew that night would leave invisible scars on our minds. On the way back home, the silence between us was heavy. We tried to process what had happened, searching for some rational explanation for the surreal encounter in the deep forest. Was that man a fugitive, a disturbed local, or had our imaginations amplified the strangeness of the situation? Regardless of the truth, we knew that experience would join the urban legends and chilling tales people share about mysterious encounters in the forests. Upon reaching home, we locked all the doors and windows, still feeling the weight of those empty eyes watching us. We spent the night awake, huddled together, jumpy at every sound in the house. The eerie forest that we once saw as a playground for our adventures had now become a symbol of terror and the unknown. We vowed never to venture off marked trails again, carrying with us the vivid memory of that night that became one of the scariest ghost stories we had ever lived through. We discovered that reality can be far more terrifying than any fiction. Imagine yourself escaping to a secluded cabin deep in the forests of Idaho, seeking peace and relief from the chaotic city life. But what if, as night falls, a strange and disturbing sound starts knocking rhythmically and methodically at the front door? Without rational explanation and no evidence at dawn, would you be prepared to face the true terror of the unknown? I am a man in my 30s, accustomed to the bustling city life. My days are filled with endless meetings and nights spent staring at glowing screens. My face reflects the fatigue of an exhausting routine. With pronounced dark circles and a stubbled beard, my shoulders carry the invisible weight of daily stress. When my longtime friend Ricardo suggested an escape to my dad's cabin in Idaho, I saw the perfect opportunity for a getaway. The promise of peace and tranquility in the deep forest was irresistible. I packed some comfortable clothes, canned food, and my favorite sleeping bag. Ricardo, always the enthusiast, brought fishing gear and an old guitar, promising nights of music and laughter. The drive to the cabin was long and quiet. As we left civilization behind, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension growing inside me. The trees along the road seemed taller and denser with each mile. Ricardo tried to cheer me up by telling stories of his latest outdoor adventures, but my mind was occupied with the idea of finally unplugging. We finally arrived. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it. Small, rustic, and cozy. The scent of wood and damp earth filled my nostrils as we stepped out of the car. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional chirping of a distant bird. Ricardo sighed deeply, absorbing the calmness of the place. As we unloaded our things, I couldn't help but notice how the forest seemed to be watching us. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than they should be. I shook my head, dismissing these thoughts. After all, we were here to relax, not to feed irrational fears. Ricardo, ever practical, suggested a walk to stretch our legs and explore the surroundings before dark. We walked on familiar trails, childhood memories resurfacing with every step. The old wooden bridge over the creek was still there, creaking under our feet. The sound of the flowing water was hypnotizing, and for a moment, I managed to forget the city stress. Ricardo was excited, planning our itinerary for the coming days: fishing, longer hikes, maybe even a dip in the lake. Night fell quickly and we retreated inside the cabin. The wooden walls enveloped us in a comforting embrace, and soon we were laughing and sharing fireside stories. Ricardo gently strummed the guitar, and the tranquil melody blended with the crackling fire. For a moment, I completely forgot about the world outside and all the worries I had brought with me. Little did I know that this night would become one of those true scary stories that would haunt my dreams for years to come. As the night progressed, our initial enthusiasm began to give way to fatigue. We decided to turn into the bunk beds upstairs, continuing our conversation in softer tones. The silence of the eerie forest seemed to amplify every whispered word. Ricardo spoke about how nature teaches us to be patient and appreciate the little moments, but my mind was starting to wander, exhausted from the long journey. It was almost midnight when we finally turned off the lantern. The darkness that enveloped us was absolute, broken only by the faint moonbeams sneaking through the cracks in the windows. I was about to drift off to sleep when I heard something, a soft sound, almost imperceptible, as if something was scraping against the front door. My entire body tensed up. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Ricardo. His affirmative response made my heart race. Before we could rationalize the sound, another noise echoed through the cabin firm, rhythmic knocks on the door. They weren't the desperate knocks of someone seeking help, nor the casual rapping of a visitor. They were deliberate knocks, almost methodical. Fear began to settle in my chest. We were miles away from civilization in the middle of nowhere. Who or what could be on the other side of that door? Ricardo, trying to keep calm, suggested it could be some curious animal, but we both knew that didn't make sense. The knocks continued, relentless. My friend and I remained frozen in our bunks, unable to move or speak. The deep forest outside, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now transformed into a prison of shadows and unexplainable sounds. The hours crawled by like an eternity. The knocks on the door persisted, intermittent, sometimes stopping for long minutes only to resume with renewed intensity. Each pause brought a mix of relief and renewed terror, for we knew the silence was only temporary. My mind raced, searching for rational explanations. A lost animal? A disoriented hunter? But no explanation seemed satisfactory. Animals don't knock on doors with such persistence, and any human would have identified themselves or asked for help. Fear kept us awake and alert. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind in the trees, became a potential new threat. The cabin, which had always been a refuge, now felt fragile and exposed. Ricardo muttered low prayers, an old habit he had abandoned, but now seemed to be the only source of comfort. In a moment of courage, or perhaps sheer desperation, I decided to look out the window. With my heart pounding in my chest, I silently crawled to the small opening. What I saw, or rather, what I didn't see, sent shivers down my spine. There was nothing out there, no shadowy figure, no animal, nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the forest. And yet the knocks continued, as if coming from an invisible being. I returned to my bunk, trembling. The horror stories we used to share around the campfire seemed childish compared to this terrifying experience. This was a true scary story, lived in real time, without the assurance of a guaranteed happy ending. The night seemed endless. Every minute stretched into hours, filled only by the sound of the knocks and our quickened breathing. The survival horror we felt was primitive, visceral. We were trapped in our own nighttime story, unable to escape or confront whatever lay on the other side of that door. The first rays of sunlight were greeted with indescribable relief. The knocks had ceased a few hours before dawn, but fear kept us immobile until daylight finally streamed through the windows. Ricardo and I looked at each other, our faces mirroring the same exhausted terror. With trembling legs, we descended the stairs. Each step toward the front door was an act of courage. When we finally opened it, we were greeted only by the familiar sight of the morning forest. There were no footprints, no marks on the wood, no visible sign of the nocturnal visitor. The forest seemed peaceful, almost mocking our nighttime terror. We searched the cabin's surroundings but found nothing out of the ordinary. As we packed our things to leave, earlier than planned, we discussed the night's events. No explanation seemed satisfactory. The absence of physical evidence made it all the more disturbing. Ricardo, usually the optimist, was visibly shaken, his confidence rattled by the unexplainable. On the drive back to civilization, the silence between us was heavy. We both knew we had experienced something that defied logic, something that would fit perfectly among the urban legends and scary tales people share, but rarely encounter. That night in the deep forests of Idaho changed us. The fear we felt was real, tangible, even if its cause remains a mystery. Sometimes the scariest spine-chilling stories are those we live through, the ones that leave us with more questions than answers. As the eerie forest faded in the rearview mirror, I knew that although we were leaving that place behind, The memories of that night would stay with us forever. The certainty that there are things we cannot explain, terrors we cannot fully comprehend, would become a part of us. Ricardo and I made a silent pact to never speak of that night again. But we both knew its shadows would follow us, constantly reminding us that the unknown still holds its own secrets. The invitation to the camping trip came as a welcome surprise. I, a 23-year-old biology student, was eager to escape the stifling routine of city life. My unruly brown hair and tired green eyes reflected the accumulated stress of the semester. When my classmate suggested a camping trip in the mountains of the Cordillera, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to reconnect with nature, and perhaps with myself. We were an eclectic group of 5. Myself, 2 classmates, and 2 of their friends whom I hadn't met before. As I packed my backpack, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. After all, the mountains were known for their scary camping stories, but I was determined not to let fear get the better of me. On the day of our departure, the sky was cloudy, as if reflecting my own uncertainty. As we gathered at the meeting point, I closely observed my travel companions. There was something about the expression of one of them, a tall, lanky guy with restless eyes, that made me uncomfortable. But I brushed off this feeling as mere pre-trip jitters. The journey to our camping spot was long and winding. As we ascended the mountains, the vegetation grew denser and the air thinner. The silence, occasionally broken by the sound of branches cracking under the wheels of our car, created a suspenseful atmosphere that I couldn't quite explain. We arrived at the clearing as the sun was setting. The site was secluded, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to touch the sky. As we set up our tents, I couldn't help but notice how the shadows lengthened, creating strange shapes on the forest floor. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized we were truly alone in this remote place, vulnerable to whatever the night might bring. As night fell, our group gathered around the newly lit campfire. The dancing flames cast restless shadows on the trees around us, setting the perfect stage for scary camping stories. My companions began to share their most spine-chilling experiences, each tale more hair-raising than the last. The restless-eyed guy whom I'd noticed earlier remained strangely quiet. His gaze fixed on the flames made me uncomfortable. When it was his turn to tell a story, he hesitated for a moment before starting in a low, trembling voice. "Have you ever heard about the disappearances in the mountains of the Cordillera?" A heavy silence fell upon the group. He went on to describe a series of inexplicable incidents involving campers who were never seen again. His words painted a vivid picture of outdoor terror that sent my heart racing. I looked at the faces of the others, illuminated by the flickering fire, and saw my own fear reflected in their eyes. When the stories ended, we all retired to our tents. The silence of the forest was deafening, interrupted only by the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Lying in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The scary stories echoed in my mind, turning every sound of nature into a potential threat. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a strange noise. It seemed to come from outside my tent, a sound of branches breaking, as if someone was moving stealthily around our camp. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the unease grew with each passing second. Mustering my courage, I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The full moon bathed the clearing in a pale, ghostly light. That was when I saw a figure moving between the trees. It was the restless-eyed guy, and he appeared to be carrying something in his hands. Something that glinted in the moonlight, something that looked eerily like a knife. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched the shadowy figure move through the trees. The moonlight reflected off the blade in his hands, confirming my worst fears. Silently, I stepped out of my tent, my bare feet touching the cold forest floor. I needed to alert the others, but I feared that any sound might attract the attention of the armed man. With cautious steps, I approached the nearest tent. Before I could reach it, I heard a muffled scream coming from the opposite direction. Panic gripped me as I realized one of us had already been attacked. The real horror stories we had shared earlier now seemed like a sinister premonition of the horror we were living through. Without a second thought, I ran into the forest. my survival instinct taking over. Branches and stones cut my bare feet, but adrenaline blocked out the pain. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps and the labored breathing of my pursuer. This scary camping experience had turned into a real-life nightmare, a true camping terror that I could never have imagined. The darkness of the forest was oppressive, only occasionally broken by beams of moonlight filtering through the treetops. Every shadow seemed to hide a danger, every sound a harbinger of death. My mind raced with frenzied thoughts about my companions. Were they alive? Had they managed to escape? Suddenly, my foot slipped on a wet rock and I fell, rolling down a small slope. I landed with a thud, the air knocked out of my lungs. For a moment I lay paralyzed, certain that my pursuer would catch up to me. But then I heard something that froze my blood. Voices. Multiple voices, coming from all directions. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse. It was an organized hunt, and I was the prey. The voices drew closer, echoing through the dark forest. My heart was pounding so hard I feared it would give me away. Lying motionless on the damp ground, I tried to control my ragged breathing. The truly scary stories we had shared around the campfire now seemed like a macabre prelude to this night of terror. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness, passing mere inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying I wouldn't be discovered. The voices grew louder, and I could distinguish scattered words. "Find him. He can't escape. Finish this." The fear paralyzed me, turning every second into an eternity of anguish. Just when I thought I couldn't bear the tension any longer, I heard a distant scream. It was a familiar voice, one of my camping companions. The sound was followed by a commotion, and the voices and lights quickly moved away in the direction of the scream. I seized the opportunity to get up and run in the opposite direction. Ignoring the pain in my bruised feet, I ran aimlessly through the forest, guided only by my survival instinct. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, bringing with the dawn's light a new wave of terror. What if my pursuers found me in the daylight? The ghost stories and scary encounters I knew of paled in comparison to this real-life horror I was experiencing. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, I stumbled upon a small clearing. To my shock and relief, I saw my camping companions gathered there, including the restless-eyed guy. They all looked scared but unharmed. Before I could speak, a group of uniformed men emerged from the forest. "It's all right now," one of them said, approaching us. "We're the local police. We received a report about a dangerous fugitive in this area and came to investigate." The realization of what had happened hit me like a bolt. This wasn't a planned attack, but a police search that had coincided with our camping trip. The stalker I had seen was actually a police officer on patrol. Our own horror stories and the eerie atmosphere of the forest had fueled our fears, turning an ordinary night into a scary camping experience. As the sun rose, illuminating the clearing, I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. The true horror wasn't in imaginary monsters or supernatural dangers, but in the way our fears could distort reality, transforming shadows into threats and innocent sounds into portents of peril. That night, in the mountains of the Cordillera, taught us a valuable lesson about the nature of fear and the importance of keeping a calm mind in stressful situations. As we packed up our camp, we vowed to never again underestimate the power of our own minds in creating the most terrifying of horrors. I never imagined that my passion for camping would bring me face to face with true horror. That night in Nederland, Colorado will forever be etched in my memory as one of the scariest camping experiences I've ever had. I was a solitary adventurer, seeking the peace and tranquility of the Rocky Mountains, far from the hustle of the city. The day started like any other. I woke up early, had my hearty breakfast, and set out on a long hike through the winding trails of the region. The fresh mountain air filled my lungs, and the bird song was my only company. As the sun began to set, I decided to set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by tall, imposing pine trees. As I pitched my tent, I couldn't help but notice the silence that seemed to intensify around me. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, awaiting something. I shook my head, brushing off these thoughts. After all, I was there to relax, not scare myself with imaginary horror stories. As night fell, I lit a small campfire. The flames danced, casting restless shadows on the trees surrounding me. I sat on a fallen log, warming my hands over the fire and gazing up at the stars that were starting to dot the dark sky. That was when I heard it, a twig snapping in the darkness beyond the campfire's light. My heart quickened, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just a wild animal, curious about my presence, but something in the back of my mind told me otherwise. The sound of approaching footsteps made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and then, emerging from the shadows like a specter, appeared a figure that chilled me to the bone. The figure that stepped out of the darkness froze my blood. He was a man, tall and bulky, wearing a dark, dirty boiler suit. But what truly terrified me was what covered his face, a beekeeper's hood, white and opaque, hiding his features completely. In his right hand he held a large hunting knife, its blade glinting in the firelight in a sinister way. I stood paralyzed, my body refusing to move as the stranger calmly walked between my tent and the campfire. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the soft thud of his boots on the ground. My mind screamed for me to run, but my muscles wouldn't respond. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. The intruder didn't utter a word, nor did he make any overtly threatening gestures. He simply continued on his way, passing by me as if I wasn't even there. The smell of sweat and earth that clung to him reached my nostrils, bringing with it a wave of nausea and fear. I could feel his gaze through that white mask, studying me, assessing me. When he finally passed me and started to move away toward the forest on the other side of the clearing, my muscles relaxed a little. But the relief was momentary. Just before he disappeared completely into the shadows, the man stopped and turned his head in my direction. Even without seeing his eyes, I could feel the intensity of his stare. It was in that moment that I realized this wasn't just any scary story. It was real. It was happening to me. The true horror of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was alone, unarmed, facing a potentially dangerous stranger in the middle of the wilderness. The scary camping stories we used to tell around the campfire seemed like child's play compared to this. My mind began to race, searching for a way out, a way to survive this terrifying encounter in the camp. With my heart hammering in my chest, I watched the stranger disappear into the darkness of the forest. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and my ragged breathing. My mind was in chaos, torn between the need to act and the paralyzing fear that held me in place. Finally, I managed to move. With trembling hands, I started to gather my things as quickly as I could. Every sound in the forest startled me, imagining the masked man's return. The outdoor terror I was experiencing was something I could never have anticipated or prepared for. As I packed, my eyes constantly scanned the darkness around me. The shadows seemed to move, and every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. It was as if the entire forest had transformed into a setting for real horror stories, with dangers lurking in every dark corner. I decided not to take down the tent. It would be too noisy and time-consuming. I grabbed only the essentials, my backpack, flashlight, and cell phone. Unfortunately, there was no signal in that remote area. I was on my own, facing one of the scariest moments of my life. With one last look at the camp, I plunged into the darkness of the forest, heading in the opposite direction from where the stranger had gone. My plan was to reach the main road, hoping to find help, or at least a spot with cell service. Every step was a challenge, with branches snapping under my feet and the constant fear of being followed. This scary camping experience was far from over, and I knew the night would be long and terrifying. The darkness of the forest enveloped me as I pushed forward, tripping over roots and rocks, with my heart in my throat. Every sound made me whirl around, expecting to see that white mask emerging from the shadows. The fear of the unknown, of what might be lurking, was almost unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, I caught a glimpse of light through the trees. I quickened my pace, hoping it was the road, but as I drew closer, I realized it was just another clearing, illuminated by moonlight. And that was when I heard them, footsteps, heavy and determined, heading in my direction. I froze, holding my breath. The hooded figure emerged from the shadows, the hunting knife still in his hand, reflecting the moonlight. He stopped a few meters away from me, his stance menacing. In that moment, I knew there was nowhere left to run. This was the climax of my camping terror, the confrontation I had feared. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I did the only thing I could. I screamed. I screamed with all the force of my lungs, a primal sound of fear and challenge. The man hesitated, seemingly surprised by my reaction. Taking advantage of this moment of confusion, I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and held it up like a weapon. What followed was a tense, silent standoff. We both stood there, assessing each other, waiting for the other's next move. And then I heard something unexpected. Distant voices and the sound of flashlights cutting through the darkness. Apparently, my scream had attracted the attention of other campers in the area. The masked man looked in the direction of the sounds and without hesitation, turned and disappeared into the forest. As silently as he had appeared, I stood there, trembling, until a group of campers found me. I explained the situation in halting words, still in shock. The authorities were called, but the man was never found. That night taught me that sometimes, truly scary stories aren't about ghosts or monsters, but about the very real dangers that can be found in the most unexpected places. My scary camping experience ended without bloodshed, but it left invisible scars that I carry to this day. Nature can be beautiful, but it can also hide terrors that defy our understanding. Get ready to be terrified with these 3 true and scary camping horror stories. Whether you're an outdoor enthusiast or just love a good scare, these stories will keep you on edge long after the campfire has died out. I was 19 when I decided to go on a camping trip with my boyfriend in the Scottish Highlands. We were young, reckless, and thirsty for adventure. We chose a secluded spot, away from the usual tourist sites, seeking an authentic experience in the wild. Little did we know that this decision would lead us to one of the most terrifying nights of our lives. The day was coming to an end when we finally found the perfect spot to pitch our tent. It was a small valley surrounded by heather-covered hills, with a crystal-clear stream meandering nearby. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and vegetation. As we set up our camp, I couldn't help but notice the oppressive silence that hung over the area. There were no bird songs or other animal sounds, just the occasional whisper of the wind through the plants. As the sun set, a fine mist started to form, enveloping our tent in a cold, damp embrace. My boyfriend decided to collect more firewood for our campfire, leaving me alone for a moment. I stepped into the tent, lit my lantern, and picked up a book, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of unease settling in my stomach. The book's pages couldn't capture my attention. My eyes kept drifting to the shadows dancing on the tent walls, cast by the flickering light of the lantern. The silence outside seemed to have intensified, as if nature itself was holding its breath. That was when I heard the first strange sound of faint dragging, as if something was cautiously moving around our tent. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself that it was just my boyfriend returning with the firewood, or maybe a curious animal, but something inside me knew it wasn't anything so innocent. The scary camping stories we heard as children suddenly didn't seem so fictional anymore. I was about to experience my own outdoor horror story, a real-life tale of terror that would be etched into my memory forever. The dragging sound continued, circling our tent with a methodical precision that chilled me to the bone. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to remain silent, fearful that any sound might attract the attention of whatever was out there. The book in my hands trembled, and I gently closed it, setting it aside. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening, amplifying each beat of my racing heart. I desperately wondered where my boyfriend was and why he was taking so long to return. The lantern flickered as if sensing my fear, and for one terrifying moment, I thought it would leave me in total darkness. That was when I noticed something strange happening to the tent's ceiling. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it started to bow inward. My eyes widened in horror as I realized it was descending, as if an invisible force was pressing down from above. Within seconds, the ceiling had lowered by about 2 feet, forcing me to lie down to avoid contact. Heart in my throat, I fixed my gaze on the taut fabric of the tent. That was when I saw something that made me question my own sanity. 10 distinct points appeared on the ceiling, pressing downward as if they were invisible fingers. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It seemed as though someone, or something, was pushing down on the tent's ceiling with both hands. The terror I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the fantastical fear of imaginary monsters or ghost stories told around the campfire. It was a true, visceral horror, born from the certainty that something inexplicable and potentially dangerous was happening. My mind screamed for rational explanations, but none presented themselves. I was living through a scary camping experience that defied logic. Paralyzed by fear, I watched as the finger marks slowly moved across the tent ceiling. Or someone. My body shook uncontrollably, and I struggled to control my breathing, fearing that the slightest sound would give away my position. The real horror stories I had dismissed as exaggerations now seemed terribly plausible. Suddenly I heard a distant scream. It was my boyfriend's voice, laden with panic and urgency. "Run!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the valley. In an instant, the finger marks disappeared from the tent ceiling, which sprang back to its original position. The momentary relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of terror. What had happened to him? Driven by fear and adrenaline, I threw myself out of the tent. The darkness outside was almost tangible, with the mist thickening and obscuring the landscape. My lantern sliced through the gloom like a knife, revealing fragments of the scene around me. That was when I saw a figure moving swiftly between the trees, running towards me. My heart pounded as I recognized my boyfriend. His face was pale with fear, his eyes wide with dread. "We have to get out of here now," he panted, grabbing my arm. I had no time to ask questions. We started running, leaving behind our tent and all our belongings. The outdoor terror we were experiencing was real and immediate. As we ran through the rugged terrain, tripping over stones and bushes, I heard the sounds of pursuit behind us. Heavy footsteps and labored breathing, too close for my comfort. I glanced back briefly and saw a dark silhouette moving among the trees, larger and faster than any animal I knew. This was not a paranormal encounter with some supernatural entity, but something equally terrifying. We were being hunted by something very real and very dangerous. Our lungs burned as we ran through the dark night, adrenaline fueling each desperate stride. The dense mist hindered our vision, turning trees and rocks into menacing shadows. The sounds of pursuit continued, sometimes seeming to lessen only to resurge with renewed vigor, as if our pursuer was toying with us. Between gasps for breath, my boyfriend managed to tell me what he had seen. While collecting firewood, he had spotted a tall, shadowy figure watching him from a distance. Initially, he thought it was another camper, but when he tried to approach, the figure moved with inhuman speed and agility. That was when he realized we were in danger and ran back to warn me. We stumbled upon a shallow stream, the icy water soaking our clothes. The intense cold was a shock, but it also gave us a moment of clarity. We realized we needed a plan beyond just running. We spotted a rocky formation ahead and decided to hide, hoping our pursuer would pass us by in the darkness. We squeezed into a small crevice between the rocks, struggling to control our ragged breathing. The minutes dragged like hours as we waited, each sound of the forest amplified by our fear. This scary camping experience was testing the limits of our courage and sanity. Suddenly, we heard heavy footsteps approaching. We froze, barely daring to breathe. An enormous shadow loomed past our hiding place, so close that I could smell the sweat and something more primal, almost animalistic. For one terrible moment, I thought we had been discovered. But the figure continued on, disappearing into the mist. We waited a few more minutes before daring to move, our bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. The rest of the night was a blur of frenzied hiking, always alert for any sound of pursuit. When the sun finally rose, we found a road and managed to flag down a passing driver for help. Only then, seated in the car of a kind stranger heading back to civilization, did we allow the reality of what we had lived through to fully sink in. We never discovered exactly what or who had pursued us on that terrible night, Local authorities mentioned rumors of a violent hermit living in the mountains, but nothing was confirmed. Whatever it was, it turned what should have been a simple camping trip into one of the truly scary stories I will carry with me forever. That night in the Scottish Highlands taught me that sometimes the deepest terror doesn't come from the supernatural, but from the unknown lurking in the shadows of the real world. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.